Algebra 2, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to talk about the quiz review from sections 5.1 to 5.3 and 5.5. These sections focus on quadratics, and if you take a look at the top corner, these are things that you will have to know for your quiz. You should be able to recognize a quadratic function given in vertex form and know how to identify the vertex as h comma k. You should also be able to identify a quadratic function in standard form and know how to find the vertex using opposite of b over 2a. You need to memorize that and know that's your x coordinate and your axis of symmetry, and once you find that value, to find the y coordinate of your vertex, you take that answer and just plug it back into your function. So when you have a choice to solve a quadratic by factoring or square rooting, take a look at your equation. Number one can be solved both ways, but if you take a look at the function and you see it does not have the linear term, the easiest way to solve it is to use the square root method. So as you can see here, we subtracted the 25 and then we divide by 81. Do not use your calculator because you know you're going to be taking a square root to solve for x squared. If you see your fraction has two perfect squares, do not divide it out and get a decimal. Just take the square root of the numerator and denominator, and you know when solving a square root, you have a positive and negative root, so you put plus and minus 10 over 9. For question number 2, you have to use factoring to solve it because it does have the linear term 6x, so we cannot use solving by square rooting. So when we use factoring to solve this, we have to get one side set equal to 0. We always want our quadratic term to be positive, so we're going to add 1 to both sides. Now, as we want to factor this, we notice our a term is not 1, so we are going to have to use factoring by grouping. So we do a times c, we get 8, and our b term is 6, so we think what factors give us a product of 8 but sum to 6, and the answers are 2 and 4. Now we do not just say x plus 2, x plus 4, because our a term is 8, we're going to rewrite our original quadratic function, splitting our middle term up into 2x and 4x. Order does not matter, you could put 4x plus 2x, I just chose to put 2x plus 4x. And now we factor by grouping. We pair them off, and out of the first pair of numbers, we can factor out a 2 and an x, and that will leave us with 2x times 4x plus 1. Now, out of the second pair of numbers, the only factor they have in common is a positive 1, but I still have to factor that out. So I put a plus 1, and then I just write 4x plus 1. I know I did it correctly because I see the matches in the parentheses, so I factor the 4x plus 1 out, and then we put together the 2x plus 1. Set that all equal to 0. Now it is factored, and now you have to solve it. Zero product property says that one of the factors must be equal to 0. So you set each one equal to 0 and solve it, and you're going to come up with x equals negative 1/4 and x equals negative half. You will have to go through you'll look at your graph, and you're going to identify a vertex, the axis of symmetry, the domain and range, as well as write the equation in vertex form. So you need to know that this is what vertex form looks like. Looking at the graph, our vertex is 3, 0, so our axis of symmetry is equal to the x coordinate. Now, to find the equation, we're going to go ahead and plug our vertex in. So we have y equals a times x minus 3 squared plus 0. This simplifies into y equals a times x minus 3 squared. You have to solve for a. So you go to your graph and you pick another point on your graph. You choose any point where the graph crosses at a corner of a square. There's multiple to choose from. I chose 4 and 1, and I plug the 4 in for x and the y and the 1 in for y. And you go through and you solve that. And as you can see that when I solve this, I get a equals 1. So when I write my answer and plug this back in, if my a value is 1, I can go ahead and write that out there, y equals 1 times x minus 3 squared. But if my a value is 1, we can just simplify it down. Domain are the values you can plug in for your x coordinate. So as I take a look at my graph, the graph is one of the most helpful ways to help us identify domain. How far to the left and how far to the right does your graph go? Well, this goes to the left towards negative infinity. This goes to the right forever towards positive infinity, so our domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. Now, our range tells us how low to how high our graph goes. We start from the bottom up. We see that our graph has a minimum. So when we're looking at a parabola, our range's minimum will start at the y coordinate of our vertex, because we see that lines up with 0, and then it continues up towards infinity forever. So when I use interval notation, I use a bracket around 0. That is my lower end, and it goes up towards positive infinity, where we use the parentheses. Number 3 is done the same similar way. You find the vertex 0, 1, axis of symmetry is equal to 0. You plug in your vertex into your equation, and you will solve for a. To solve for a, you pick a point. I chose 1 and 2, plugged it in, and I continue to solve it. You can follow the steps there. A is equal to 1. So when I go ahead and plug the 1 value back in, I do not have to put 1x squared. We can just simplify that to x squared plus 1. Once again, we see our domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity, and our range starts at our lowest y value lines up with 1, and it goes up to infinity. So it's a bracket around 1 up to infinity. Now, when you have story problems and you see that it's using a quadratic model and they're asking you to find a maximum or minimum, that should be a signal to you that you're going to be looking for the vertex. So here we have a model rocket. The h is the altitude of the height in meters, and that height is written as a function of time, t in seconds. So we see that here. Find the maximum height. One of the things I think is a great strategy is just to sketch a picture. So if you put this in standard form, h equals negative 16t squared plus 64t, because your a value is negative, you know your graph is going to open down and you're going to have your maximum. Now, if we look instead of x and y, we use t and h. So in order to find the maximum height, you first have to find the x coordinate, which in this case is t. We're going to have to find the time at which it reaches the maximum height. Well, to find t, we're going to do opposite of b over 2a. A is negative 16, B is 64. So you plug that in and you're going to find the time is 2 seconds. Make sure when you answer the question that you use your units. You don't just put 2. So at 2 seconds it reaches its maximum height. So to find that maximum height, you take the 2 seconds and you're going to plug it into your original equation up here, which I've done down here below, and it's 64 meters. So my answer should be 64 meters. So again, if you have a quadratic model and they're asking for a minimum or maximum, that's a good strategy, is to draw the picture and use the formulas to help you find the vertex. Okay, the second part of the quiz will be done without a calculator. Make sure you read the directions, and you should be practicing and studying without a calculator. You have to plot 3 points. You will have to draw and label the axis of symmetry on the graph, so don't forget that. And you're also going to label the vertex on the graph. So we'll go over 6 and 9 first. 6 and 9 are done in standard form. So if you have to find the vertex in standard form, you have to know that x is the opposite of b over 2a. You should identify your a, b, and c term. So you figure that out, opposite of b over 2a, without a calculator, and x is going to be 3. Now this is the part where students will make a mistake. They're going to go ahead and plug the 3 where they see an x. So it's the opposite of 3 squared plus 6 times 3 minus 1. This is not negative 3 squared. It's just squaring the 3 and then taking the opposite. This is the opposite of x squared. So you're going to square the 3 squared and you're going to get 9. This becomes 18. So now I have the opposite of 9, which is negative 9 plus 18, which will give me a positive 9, and 9 minus 1 will equal 8. So my vertex is 3, 8. So be careful of that, because you're not using a calculator. Students will mess that up. And if you tell me this is positive 9, you're going to end up with the wrong answer. And then your whole problem will be wrong. So if the vertex is 3, 8, axis of symmetry is at 3. And then it's going to be a maximum because my a value is negative. That means my graph opens down. And the minimum or maximum value will be found at the y coordinate. So my maximum will be found at x equals 8. So the maximum is at 8. So now it says to plot your vertex. So you plot the vertex, you label it, you draw your axis of symmetry, you label it on your graph. Axis of symmetry is x equals 3. And now you got to plot 3 points. Well, when it's in standard form, the y-intercept will be found at the value of c. So my c, if I take a look here, is negative 1. So I plot my y-intercept at negative 1, and then I can reflect it over and draw my graph. If you take a look at question number 9, same idea. It's in standard form. So you're going to do opposite of b over 2a. I have that over here. And again, identify your a, your b, and your c value. Opposite of b over 2a is the opposite of negative 8. Again, it's another mistake students will make, so be careful of that. Opposite of negative 8 over 2 times 2, that's 8 over 4, which is 2. X coordinate is 2. You're going to plug that in. You'll do 2 squared first. Another mistake students will make is they'll go 2 times 2 and then square. You have to know your order of operations. 2 squared becomes 4. This is 4 times 2. That will become 8. When you simplify this whole thing down without a calculator, 8 minus 16 is negative 8. Negative 8 minus 4 is negative 12. So your vertex is at 2 and negative 12. Axis of symmetry is at 2. Since my a value is positive, it opens up. That means I have a minimum, and the minimum will be at negative 12. Now, when you were to go and graph this, you're going to see that you do not have enough tick marks to go by 1. And I didn't mention this before, but you should always label your scale. You got to tell me what you're going by. So I decided to make this fit in my graph. I went with a Y scale of 2s, and my X scale went by 1s. So I plotted 2 and negative 12. My y-intercept is at negative 4, so I plotted that, reflected that over. I have 3 points, and I can now graph. Notice my vertex is labeled on my graph as well as my axis of symmetry. Okay, so let's take a look at the last 2 questions. For question number 7, it is in vertex form. When it's in vertex form, it's very easy to find the vertex, 2 and 5. Axis of symmetry is at 2. Because my A value is positive, it's going to open up. So it has a minimum, and the minimum will be at 5. So now we're going to go ahead and graph this. We're going to plot our vertex, and our vertex is at 2 and 5. And you want to make sure you have that labeled on your graph. So I'm going to put that on here. 2 and 5, there's my vertex. I have my axis of symmetry. I drew that in, and it's labeled as x equals, whoops, that should be x equals 2. Let's fix that. Axis of symmetry is at x equals 2. And then now you have to find another point. Well, to find another point when it's in vertex form, go ahead and make a table, put your vertex on, and then just pick a point to the right of your vertex. Since I'm at 2 and 5, my next x value would be 3. And then without a calculator, I just go ahead and I plug 3 into my equation and solve it. So when I solve that, my y value is 8. So I plot the 3 and 8, and then I reflect it over and should be able to draw my graph. So in vertex form, you have the vertex, but then you make a table and you pick another value and plug it in. And my suggestion is just go to the positive side of the vertex, so towards the right, to the right of your vertex. So when we take a look at question number 8, same idea. We have our vertex is going to be opposite of negative 3, so it should be 3, positive 2. The axis of symmetry is 3. The graph opens up because it has an A value of 1, so it has a minimum at 2. So we are going to go ahead and plot our vertex at 3 and 2, and it should be labeled. And then we're going to have our axis of symmetry drawn in, and you're going to label that. And then you can plug points in. Now, when I plugged in the 4, I found that my y value was 3, and it was pretty close, and I was going to I wanted just to have a better sketch, so I actually went ahead and I plugged in the 5 as well. But yes, you could do a set of 3 points, so that would work. I think I just want you to really have a clear picture, so that's why I thought, well, let's go ahead and plug one more in, and then you can plug in the 5, your output will be 6, and you sketch it. So again, all these skills you have to be solid on, and you have to be able to do it without a calculator. If you do not know vertex form and how to find the vertex, if you do not know standard form and the formula is opposite of b over 2a, how to find axis of symmetry, if you do not sit down and understand and learn those, this will not go well. So do your best to make sure that you are getting the skills down necessary in order to be successful. Have a good night.